All right, well, I guess we should go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Tiara Curry. I'm a senior scientist here at the center, and my computer is trying to update. Let's make that stop. Sorry about that. So I just moved across the country, and now I am on occupied Cherokee land. So I'm talking to you from Kentucky today. That was a big move, Oregon to Kentucky, but the good news is I have so many monarch butterflies in my yard now. It's very exciting. So today we're going to talk about pesticides and how to protect people and wildlife from them. Whether it's a single pesticide or a combination, an herbicide or an insecticide, we're exposed to these chemicals in our daily life all the time. And I used to think that pesticides were certain chemicals applied in certain situations and they were very carefully regulated. And I, even as an environmentalist, had no idea just how ubiquitous their use is. I thought that only really sensitive groups like frogs were exposed to them. So today I'm excited to learn from our two experts who work on these all the time. And it's a really big problem, and we definitely need your help to tackle it. So thanks for joining us. And I'm really glad that I don't have to work on the chemicals that they work on because I can't pronounce them at all. So a couple technical notes. We've disabled chat because it can be really distracting. We're going to save 20 minutes to answer your questions at the end. We'll be on Slack tomorrow from noon to 1 Pacific if you want to continue the conversation. And you'll get an email after the webinar with instructions on how to join Slack and a link to the video, which will go up tomorrow, and also a link to an action alert that you can take to help protect wildlife from pesticides. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to our guests to introduce themselves. Lorianne, you're on mute.
Hi, I'm Lorianne Burd. I'm the Environmental Health Director here at the Center and also a senior attorney. And I am in beautiful Portland, Oregon.
Nate, you're on mute too.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Nathan Donley. I'm a senior scientist in the Environmental Health Program at Center for Biological Diversity. I've been here for about 5 years, and my work focuses mostly on how pesticides affect people and wildlife, and how federal pesticide policy and pesticide regulation.
Well, I'm super excited to chat with you both today about this issue. Lorianne, let's start with you. Why are we talking about pesticides today? What do they even have to do with endangered species and extinction?
Well, pesticides are poisons designed to kill, so they don't distinguish between endangered species and the critters they're maybe intended to kill. So they have a lot of impacts beyond killing the target species that people might be seeking to go after. I'll start with a species that you mentioned that we all love, the monarch butterfly. About a decade ago, people started really noticing a major decline in monarch butterflies across the nation. I'm sure many of you on this call today have noticed just in your own yards that you're seeing fewer bugs, fewer butterflies, your windshield is cleaner when you take a road trip. Well, it turns out that in our country, we use over 1 billion pounds of pesticides each year and about 300 million pounds of glyphosate, just one pesticide that sometimes is called Roundup. And Roundup is extremely good at killing milkweed. And there's only one plant that baby monarchs need to survive and thrive, and that's milkweed. So when you have glyphosate used across the entire country in huge quantities, you wipe out all the country's milkweed, and then you get into a situation where you have a 99% decline of West Coast monarch butterflies and massive declines of butterflies throughout the country otherwise. We've also heard a lot about pollinator declines. There's a class of pesticides called neonicotinoids that are especially toxic for pollinators. They, in addition to just killing them outright, they can cause them to become disoriented, to have a hard time finding their way home, to not eat enough, to forget how to fight off predators and other important basic tasks. Those pesticides are used across hundreds of millions of acres in the United States and are a leading cause of our current pollinator declines. And you'd think, like you said, Tiara, that EPA would closely regulate these poisons because their job is supposed to be protecting human health and the environment. But instead, they've basically ignored the impacts of pesticides on endangered species and refused to do their job, which of course, us being Center for Biological Diversity, we sue them over all the time. But the consequences are major. For example, one pesticide that many of you may have heard of, chlorpyrifos, it's neurotoxic to children, it causes horrible poisoning to farm workers, and it's also really bad for endangered species. So after years and years and years of haggling and battling, we finally convinced the agencies that they had to put out an analysis of this. And the National Marine Fisheries Service put out their analysis, and they found that all salmon species, all West Coast salmon, orcas, they were all jeopardized by just this one pesticide, chlorpyrifos. So just one pesticide jeopardizes the continued existence of all salmon on the West Coast and orcas. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service put out its analysis, and folks at the highest level of our government intervened. And finally, we got our answer to why there was intervention from the White House when we received a document pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act that showed that almost 1,400 endangered species are jeopardized by just this one chemical. So just incredible how severe the harms are to species across the board: San Joaquin kit foxes, bumblebees, northern spotted owl, Indiana bats, just an incredible swath of harms caused by pesticides. And for many species facing a number of threats, pesticides can really be the threat that puts them over the edge.
That is sad and overwhelming, and it just shows how much power the pesticide industry has in our country. So, Nate, how widespread is pesticide use?
Well, pesticides are used in most places around the world. In fact, if you went up to the North or South Pole and took an ice core sample, you'd find pesticides. And not just legacy pesticides like DDT that were banned a long time ago, pesticides that are still in use today. So there's really no place on Earth that hasn't been touched by pesticides in one way or another. And in the US specifically, we use about 1.2 billion pounds of pesticides every year, each year, year after year. And that comes out to about 4 pounds of pesticide per person per year. That's a lot. And about 90% of the pesticides used in this country are used in agriculture, 90%. So unlike most manufactured chemical pollutants, which tend to be sort of congregated in urban areas and areas where there's a lot of people, pesticides are kind of the inverse of that. You have them really being concentrated where people aren't, out in open spaces and fields and rangeland. So, you know, the effects on wildlife is really heightened because of that. And that's really one reason our program has really a strong focus in pesticides and their harms, because it does have such an outsized effect on wildlife compared to a lot of other pollutants.
So, Lorianne, you talked about this a little bit, but are federal agencies adequately protecting wildlife and endangered species from all this pesticide exposure?
No. It's pretty shocking, the level of recalcitrance that we see from federal agencies. And I'll read you a quote that I just saw right before our webinar from the head of the EPA. He was asked about registration of a really bad pesticide that we just got vacated in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, dicamba. And the court noted that this pesticide had torn apart the social fabric of rural communities because it caused so much harm through drift. And they took the extraordinary step of saying that this pesticide's registration could not stand because EPA had ignored the many significant costs that it was causing to rural communities, to growers. When asked about this today, or sorry, a few days ago, the head of the EPA, Administrator Wheeler, said, "Our goal is to register as many different pesticides as possible so that people have a complete slate of tools to pick." It's just really shocking. His job is to protect human health and the environment, and Instead, he's just turned his back on that and has completely sided with pesticide companies. Other agencies, frankly, aren't really doing that much better. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service have refused to hold EPA's feet to the fire. They have the power, and we've asked them to exercise that power with a formal legal petition to ban all pesticide use on critical habitat for endangered species, and they haven't done anything about it. This year, USDA was looking at a proposal to use 4 ultra-toxic pesticides in 17 different states to kill native grasshoppers that were interfering with cattle operations. They barely gave a thought to endangered species impacts. We commented on every single state's proposal and we beat back some of the worst of it, but that just kind of shows you what the federal agencies are doing and how little care they're giving.
So the wildlife agencies aren't taking very specific steps to protect endangered species, but what about public land management agencies?
Well, so start with the National Wildlife Refuge System. Sort of sounds like a place where wildlife might find a refuge. I don't know, maybe I'm naive, but we're actually about to release a new report. I'll give you guys a little sneak preview of our findings. 350,000 pounds of dangerous pesticides were sprayed on hundreds of thousands of acres of agricultural crops on our national wildlife refuges in 2018, the latest year that we could get data for. That's a 34% increase from 2016. So the problem is actually getting worse. And they're using really bad pesticides. They're using pesticides like 2,4-D, that's famous for being part of Agent Orange, dicamba that I mentioned earlier, that was found to tear apart the social fabric of rural communities, paraquat, huge amounts of all different kinds of pesticides. So it's a really serious problem because for many species, these wildlife refuges are their last haven, and it's a big threat to them. On national forests, we're constantly fighting back proposals to use pesticides for all kinds of things. In Oregon, there was a roadside spraying to beat back weeds. The herbicide they used killed over 2,000 ponderosa pines, including a lot of old growth pines. Luckily, that pesticide was banned in Oregon and we're part of that work, but it's not banned in a lot of other places and we're still fighting it in places where there are ponderosa pines, like in New Mexico and Arizona. So it's a big problem even on our public lands.
And after they clear cut, don't they spray like herbicides to keep trees from growing back?
Yeah, especially like in Oregon on our state forest lands, there's a huge amount of herbicide use to keep shrubs and other things from growing back so they can just focus on raising tree plantations. And that of course gets into waterways. It affects people, it affects schools, hospitals. It's a really serious problem.
So Nate, let's go back to you. Tell us about the risks to people from all this pesticide use.
Yeah, well, it's complicated. Each pesticide kind of poses a very unique risk to people. We have about, I'd estimate, 800 to 1,000 different pesticides registered with the EPA right now. And every single one of them is different in their toxicities to people and wildlife. So some are more benign. You have things like, I don't know, rosemary oil extract or something that's used in organic agriculture. And others like paraquat, which Lori had mentioned earlier, which is a weed killer, where it's extremely toxic. A teaspoon is enough to kill a full-grown adult person, and it's actually used as a suicide agent in some parts of the world, which is just terrible. And then you have differences in pesticide, their ability to stick around. Some stick around a long time, decades in fact, others break down within a few hours. So all these factors really sort of come together to give a different picture of how a pesticide can harm a person. So, you know, to our EPA's defense, it's a really difficult problem. It's just, there's a lot of data that goes into identifying what is safe and what's harmful. And so, unfortunately, our EPA is not up to the task. So I'll just say that those most at risk of harm are children and those who work occupationally with pesticides. Kids eat and drink more per their body weight than adults do. So any food or water contamination is going to have a disproportionate impact on them. Children and young people are also actively developing, and these developmental pathways are extremely sensitive to environmental pollutants, pesticides of which are a major one. So, children ages 0 to 20 or so are really just going to have a greater effect to any exposure they have. And then occupational exposures, of course, is just self-explanatory. You're just getting exposed to so much more than the general population. So it's really important that people remember that pesticides are poisons. And it sounds crazy that I even have to say that. But the pesticide companies have been very good at referring to them as tools or pest control strategies or something like that, which is really designed to diminish their seriousness. And I think it makes a lot of people more complacent than they really should be, and not apt to take appropriate precautions.
Can you talk to us about the disproportionate impacts across communities from pesticide manufacturing and use?
Yeah, this is really important. I'd say if there's one thing that I hope people come away with is that pesticides are not an equal opportunity killer. There are major racial and income disparities built into the entire system that surrounds and protects pesticide use. So, as you mentioned, the manufacture of pesticides, most of them aren't just extracted out of the ground, they're synthesized in huge labs and facilities. And these polluting factories target neighborhoods and areas with a high number of people of color and lower income because they face generally less pushback. So these polluting factories where pesticides are manufactured happen near fence-line communities. And they're the ones who are breathing in the fumes. They're the ones who are drinking the water that's getting contaminated. So that's, the beginning of the pesticide life cycle. You've got the manufacture, and then you've got the use. And as I said before, 90% of pesticides are used in agriculture. So farm workers are bearing the brunt of the exposures, and farm workers, about 80% of who identify as Hispanic or Latino. So there's incredible racial disparities in who is getting exposed to pesticides, who's having the highest exposures. And then you have other things like people who rent their home or apartment have less control over pesticide use there than people who own. Subsistence and indigenous populations can have diets higher in certain foods. For example, many native populations will have a diet that's very high in fish. And that's not typical of the average American diet. When EPA looks at risk to people from pesticide ingestion from food, they'll look at the typical average American diet. And if you eat fish once a week, you've got a very different exposure profile than someone who eats fish twice a day, every day. And pesticides can biomagnify up the food chain and exist at really high levels in apex predators like fish or mammals. And then you've got things like groundwater contamination. Pesticides are major groundwater contaminants. And people who get their water from a well, often lower income or rural communities, are really dependent on whatever's in their groundwater. They don't generally have to meet the safety standards that municipalities do who provide water to most of the people in this country. So there's enormous disparities. And it's a really big issue.
Do you remember that paper that came out a few years ago? I think it was a USGS study, and they looked at groundwater for atrazine contamination, and they found atrazine in every single place that they sampled.
Yeah, atrazine is, you know, once it gets in the water, you just can't get it out, and it sticks around for so long. And so, you know, it's the second most widely used pesticide in the United States. After glyphosate, it's atrazine. We use about 60 to 70 million pounds each year. And I would say, to me, it's just really one of the most worrisome because it doesn't break down. Whatever's put into the environment will reach someone or something at some point. And that's really worrisome from a human health and a wildlife perspective. I mean, this stuff just doesn't leave, and it really loves water. Atrazine partitions with the water. And so if it gets, you know, if something gets in the groundwater, you can't really clean it out. It's just there until it comes back out. So yeah, it's really worrisome.
And I'll just add, you know, we know so much about atrazine being a potent endocrine disruptor. It's banned in so many places, and this administration has proposed to allow a 50% increase of atrazine in waterways. So it's pretty bad.
Yeah, and I'll just, if I can just add to what I said earlier too, you know, the racial and income disparities with pesticide use and manufacture, that's really amplified in federal law as well. You've got different exposure scenarios treated differently. So there's some group of people, people who get exposed to pesticides in their diet, in water, through residential use, that are under a safety standard called reasonable certainty of no harm. That means EPA has to make sure that its approval doesn't harm this group of people. It doesn't work that way in practice, unfortunately, but that's a subject for a whole other webinar. But in the plain letter of the law, this group of people, their lives are, they're really considered sacred. You can do no harm to them. And there's another group of people, those who are exposed occupationally to pesticides, who fall under a different safety standard called no unreasonable adverse effects. And this basically means that there's a cost-benefit analysis that goes into them, to harm to them. And harm is allowed to this group of people, those exposed occupationally, as long as the purported benefits of pesticide use outweigh those harms. So you've got, basically our federal law is giving protections to this group of people that these people aren't afforded, that are overwhelmingly minority. And their life is essentially monetized to the point where harm to them is allowed as long as certain people make enough money. So, you know, our pesticide law is really perpetuating this system and really needs to change.
Talk about an example of systemic oppression. I didn't even know there was different standards of protection. So let's play devil's advocate for a minute. How are we going to feed 8 billion people without pesticides? Would the food system and the economy collapse if we did things differently? Lorian, you want to take this one? You're just smiling.
The reality is how we grow food today has nothing to do with traditional agriculture. It's a giant chemical experiment that's lining the pockets of pesticide companies with billions of dollars at the expense of human health and the environment. We've grown food for a long, long time and fed humans for a long time without all these chemicals and without causing all this cancer, without causing early death for farm workers. We do have a lot of hungry mouths to feed, but the way we're growing food, it's not really growing food. What we're doing is producing massive amounts of commodity crops using monocultures across hundreds of millions of acres. And then those monocultures produce things that we use to make, like for example, most of the corn that's grown in this country is not fed to humans. It's not edible. It's feed corn. It's used for biofuel, or it's used for animal feed. It's used to make things like high fructose corn syrup. So when you actually look at the total acreage in the US that's used to grow crops, you have to distinguish between what's growing crops and what is actually growing nourishing, wholesome food that people can consume. And there's a vast disparity there. One of the big issues we have is that we eat too much meat, and a lot of our commodity crops are used to feed animals in industrial animal agricultural settings. So if you take a plant-based burger and a meat burger, you'll find if you do a comparison and you're feeding both on soy, let's say you're feeding both on regular GE monocultured soy, it takes 89 times more of that GE soy to grow a pound of meat from an animal than a pound of plant-based meat. So we can really reduce the total acreage we use to grow crops by simply reducing our meat production. And we also have to recognize that the costs of industrial agriculture have been externalized, and we need to look at those costs in a real way. So in addition to causing early death for farm workers, in addition to polluting waterways, we're destroying soil health, and many of those soils will never recover. And if we do recover them, it's going to take work. It's going to take serious work. And we also are losing our bees. We're losing our native pollinators, especially. A new study came out recently finding that native bees produced about $1.5 billion in pollination services on just 6 crops in the US. They'd probably produce a lot more in pollination services if they weren't getting wiped out by pesticides. EPA refuses to do hardly anything about it. They've said, if you've hired honeybee hives to come pollinate your field, it would be better if you didn't use bee killing pesticides at that same time. But that's about as far as they've gone, which is pretty outrageous considering scientists describe what we're in as an insect apocalypse. So no, our food and farming system would not collapse, but there's a lot of room for improvement, and the track we've been on is a radical experiment, and we need to shift gears.
So in the interest of claiming food security, we're undermining long-term food security, basically. So Nate, I know that you wrote a report recently about pesticides that are banned in other countries, but that are still allowed for use in the United States. What is that about?
Yeah, it's been almost exactly a year now since I published that. So comparing pesticide use between us and other major agricultural economies, specifically the European Union and Brazil and China, I found that there were about 70 pesticides at the time. Now it's probably about 80 that are approved in the US that are banned in the European Union. 17 pesticides that are banned or being phased out in Brazil that we still use in the US, and 11 in China, pesticides that are banned in China that are still used here. So all in all, those pesticides, they're not just used here and there. Together they come out to about 330 million pounds of pesticides banned in at least one of those places that are still used in the United States. That's a full quarter of our total pesticide use is pesticides banned elsewhere in other large agricultural producing nations. India, another huge agricultural powerhouse, has recently announced plans to ban 27 additional pesticides, many of which are used very widely in the US, like 2,4-D and, as we mentioned before, atrazine. So those are 2 of the most widely used weed killers in the US. That comes out to at least 100 million pounds of pesticides used in the US that are going to be banned in India soon. So, I wanted to compare us with other countries that have a high agricultural output so I could get a sense of how we compare to our peers around the world at getting rid of the worst pesticides. And we're falling behind big time. And this is, I think this is a surprise to a lot of people, seeing as we're this very wealthy nation with generally a very robust regulatory infrastructure in general, you know, that we could be allowing these poisons for use in our borders that even many developing countries are saying, no way, you know, get these out of here. So to me, it really shows that pesticide use in this country, at least the use of a lot of the worst pesticides, really has no economic value, right? These other places are still competing in terms of agricultural production without using them, yet we're still using them for no reason other than the fact that the pesticide companies essentially run our regulatory agencies, and that's really it. So we really have a lot of work to do to just say, you know what, we need to identify the worst pesticides that are causing the most harm, and we need to get them out of here to, at the very least, be on the same level as our peers. And we've got a lot more work to do if we want to, you know, start moving ahead, which is where I think we need to go.
Do you have any specifics on how or why they were banned in other places, but they're still allowed here?
Yeah, it varies quite a bit. The European Union has very stringent safeguards on groundwater. So if a pesticide makes it into a groundwater, you know, even at pretty low levels, the European Union is like, this is not worth using here. And I agree with that, because once something gets in the groundwater, it's there. You know, if it doesn't break down, it's there until it's taken out of the ground and ingested by humans or who else. So that's a big one. Another one is Europe just has a higher safety standard for these things. If they identify a pesticide as, you know, a carcinogen or an endocrine disruptor, European law says that pesticide can't be used there. Whereas I can name probably 24 pesticides off the top of my head that the EPA itself says probably cause cancer that are still used here. So we just, you know, there's just a different ideology here than there is in Europe. And unfortunately, it errs on the side of risk rather than the side of safety. And then I think a lot of these more developing countries like China and Brazil and India are just looking at just how bad things are in their country and trying to do something about it, trying to catch up with some of these other places. And you know, they're doing better, which is good for them, but we're staying the same. And so they're outpacing us, which is really bad for us.
Let's take just a minute to talk about other chemicals that are sprayed on crops. Like, I know you've done work with antibiotics that are sprayed on citrus. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, most people on this call will probably know that antibiotics are way overused in agriculture. But most people recognize that antibiotics are used mainly on animals in feedlots and such to sort of prevent disease from these really awful conditions that they're being kept in. But a lot of people don't know that medically important antibiotics that are used to prevent and treat disease in humans are used as pesticides in plant agriculture. So we actually, in this country, treat plants with medically important antibiotics to prevent bacterial diseases in those plants. And it's becoming an issue that is really skyrocketing use of these antibiotics as pesticides in agriculture. So since the 60s or so, we've been using antibiotics like streptomycin, which is used to treat tuberculosis, as well as oxytetracycline, which is used for a number of human diseases as well. We've been using those on fruit trees for many years now. These are mainly like apples and peaches and pears. But just a couple years ago, the EPA proposed to approve them on citrus crops, which are very widely grown in the US, typically in places like Florida and California. So these are things like oranges, nectarines, limes, lemons, stuff like that, grapefruit. The EPA is allowing use of these medically important antibiotics on these fruit trees, and these recent proposals are going to increase their use dramatically. And so where this is an issue is in terms of human health. When you start using antibiotics more and more, bacteria that just exist in the environment start to become resistant to those medicines. And if that bacteria happens to be a human health pathogen, then if it infects someone, they're not going to have the full suite of medicines available to treat their disease that would normally be the case. So the worry about using antibiotics that are used in human medicine out in the environment is that it can start to select for bacteria that are resistant to these medicines. So it can make them ineffective when they're really needed to save people's lives. They can also impact the environment in many ways. These antibiotics get into the water and can be drank by people and wildlife. We're learning more about the importance of the gut microbiome and all the bacteria and all the organisms that live in our digestive tract. Even the ones that live on our skin provide incredibly important services to help us and other animals be in our healthy state. And so there's been a lot of research on how antibiotic use on plants can actually impact the gut microbiome of bees and other insects. Insects also have bacteria in their gut as well, just like we do. And they're very important for the normal functioning of those organisms. And when you start messing with that with antibiotics that can kill some bacteria while at the same time allowing other bacteria to flourish, you start messing with that, the balance in the gut, and it can do things like impair a bee's ability to home and get back to where they nest. Can impair a butterfly's ability to find a flower that has nectar in it and stuff like that. So using these antibiotics on a wide scale, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres in the United States, is really worrisome. And it's being used to treat a disease called citrus greening disease. And it's not really even that effective on it. It doesn't cure the disease. And at most you might get a few more bushels of fruit off those trees, but it's just not worth the risk in our opinion. And we've been fighting really hard to push back on EPA on this. And we'll see what eventually happens. But we're really willing to go to bat on this because it's an important issue that affects not only humans, but our natural world as well.
So it sounds like there's a ton of work that needs to be done. We have passionate people on this call who want to help. How can they help?
Like I mentioned earlier, meat production really drives a lot of crop production. And so by eating lower on the food chain, you can really reduce the total amount of pesticides used, especially if you're eating conventional food and conventional meat. I think there's a common myth out there that organic food is like a fancy thing that you eat, between yoga classes if you're very rich. And it's just sort of a personal health lifestyle thing. But the truth is eating organic is one of the best things you can do for farm workers. It's one of the best things you can do for endangered species. Our consumer dollars actually matter when it comes to choosing our food. So, obviously, if you can afford it, it's a great thing to do. And in many instances, organic food isn't that much more expensive for foods like basic staples like carrots, onions, potatoes. There are terrible pesticides used on the conventional ones, and you can buy them organic, maybe spend an extra 20 cents a pound. If you have that 20 cents to spare and you want to give farm workers a break from pesticide exposure, or you want to give bugs a break, that's definitely one thing you can do. And when stores see that more and more people are purchasing those things, then they stock more of them and they stock fewer of the non-organic options. When you're at your local nursery, you can ask them for organic nursery stock. You can make sure that your own landscaping is organic. Urban areas have become a major refuge for native bees because rural areas are so poisoned with pesticides. And so it's important not to diminish how valuable it is to provide organic habitat for all the critters that have fled those heavily poisoned areas. And I'll also say, I know this sounds cheesy, but it's important to vote. The reason we have an EPA administrator who says his job is to get as many pesticides out there as possible is because we have a president who selected that person, a person who would stand up for pesticide company interests instead of the interests of human health and the environment. And so don't forget that your vote matters for a lot of reasons. And then of course, support groups doing this work. Nate, I don't know if you have other ideas.
Yeah, I'll add on to that a little bit. I'll definitely reiterate to vote. It's very important, not only on the federal level, but on the state and local level as well. Those elected officials have a lot of sway over policy in your state, and that's, in some cases just as important as federal policy as well. So anytime you're able to vote for people who share your values, and I'll also say just educate. And you don't need to be an expert on pesticides to do this. In fact, you don't even need to know anything about pesticides at all. Talk to your family, talk to your friends about how it makes you feel when you read in the paper that 12 farm workers had to be rushed to the emergency room because they went into a field and started vomiting. Tell people how frustrated you are that there are beautiful creatures on this planet that may be wiped out forever because of our regressive pesticide policy. Talk to your inner circle, people who you know and love and trust. And what I personally have in my circle isn't people who disagree with me, but people who are just apathetic, ambivalent. They don't, they kind of care, but they don't really. And so when they see people be emotional and talk about how important some of these things are, you're not going to reach everyone, but some people may really resonate with the way you feel. And you can turn someone who doesn't care about something into someone who really does. So have those conversations. They can be awkward. Everyone has that crazy uncle, that one. But have those conversations. And if you can just change the mind of 5 people in your lifetime, that's enormous. And that's something that everyone can do. So have that be your goal.
All right, thanks you too. Let's take some questions that people are typing into the question box. Someone asked about legal interventions. It's not a very specific question, but is the Center for Biological Diversity intervening legally to combat Bayer and DuPont and the major corporations?
There's no major pesticide corporation that we haven't seen in court that we're not currently enmeshed in legal battles with. We're taking them all on day after day. And these are big, nasty fights, and they have enormous resources to throw at this. And they know exactly what the stakes are, because if we had a sane pesticide regulatory system, it would hit their bottom line. So like, for example, when the US Fish and Wildlife Service was about to put out its analysis of how chlorpyrifos was affecting endangered species, they sent a letter and they said, hey, we really don't like this. And all of a sudden, a half decade of work was scuttled. And that was because they knew that the findings would make it impossible for chlorpyrifos to continue to be widely used in this country. So yes, we are absolutely taking them all on in court. We have, I couldn't right now off the top of my head say how many pesticide cases we have, but quite a few, many with partners, some just by ourselves. And happy to talk about specific ones if people have questions about them.
So there's a ton of information on the internet about this chemical is safe, this chemical isn't, what to do about this or that. Are there websites you would recommend that offer safe alternatives to pesticides, or alternately that list really bad things people should avoid?
I'll start, Lorianne, then you can add to this. We've got a lot of amazing partners we work really a lot with, who focus a lot on alternatives. I would say the Xerces Society is one that has really good resources for people who want to identify safer products and safer pesticides or non-pesticidal methods to use in their own home garden or lawn or whatever the case is. Beyond Pesticides has a lot of really good resources as well. We also have some resources as well on our webpage, mainly on rodenticides. That would be a really good resource for you to look at. And do you have anything to add, Lorianne?
Oh, I'll just say the webpage for rodenticide information is Safe Rodenticides. There's a saferodentcontrol.org. And you can get more information there. Rodenticides, we didn't even get a chance to talk about, but use of rodenticides, to kill mice and rats and all kinds of things, has really significant impacts. For example, the San Joaquin kit fox in California is really hit hard by rodenticide use, a beautiful little fox that eats the mice that get poisoned, and that poison bioaccumulates and they die horrible, slow deaths. So definitely take the time to educate yourself about these chemicals. Don't use them casually. Don't use them at all if you can avoid them. There are lots of other options out there.
Yeah, mid-sized forest carnivores, you mentioned the kit fox, but I'm going to say it, the Humboldt marten and the Pacific fisher, all of the things that prey on smaller mammals are really at risk because of rodenticide exposure, even though they live in the wilderness, because of uses in forestry or because of the urban boundary. So the food chain gets contaminated. Two people have asked about pesticides used by government agencies to combat invasive species.
Yeah, I'm glad someone asked about that. So this is a tricky issue. Invasive species can be a major threat to endangered species, and I don't want to diminish that at all. I think there's also a major issue with agencies using pesticides very casually, using them as the very first resort, using really dangerous pesticides as a first go-to. There are many, many ways to treat invasive species. Some of them are hand pulling or weed whacking or mowing. Sometimes there are solutions like taking cows off the forest land. Cows really do a lot of damage by spreading invasive species. So that's another option. Sometimes there can be really extreme situations where there's possibly no other option, but what we see time and time again is agencies just going to the easiest thing that they think is going to immediately solve their problem, and not considering fully the impacts of that and how that's going to affect that land for the long term, and whether that's going to impact the ability of native plants to come back or native animals. So there's a major analysis, but what we always advocate is for the least harmful intervention possible, while recognizing that invasive species can be a big problem.
I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Nate. I think the next one might be for you. It's about the precautionary principle. And is the center advocating for the burden of proof to shift to that a chemical is safe rather than that it's harmful?
Absolutely. That's my belief. That's certainly something that we do advocate for. I believe the burden of proof should be on the chemical company, the company that wants to put their pollutant onto the earth. They should have to show it's safe, other than it assumed to be safe until it can be shown not to be safe. What we're seeing is, if there was trillions and trillions of dollars available for scientific research in this country, that might be doable because you'd actually have people studying these things. But right now, discretionary spending is really low. There's no research dollars for these types of experiments that come from anywhere other than the chemical companies. And so what we're, when you don't use a precautionary principle, you're basically allowing something to be used, without much oversight, because there isn't the money available to look at how this is affecting this species or how this is affecting the groundwater in this area. Those funds just aren't there. So I think that's a really important consideration to think about when you're talking about where the burden of proof should be, is who has the money to pay for it. And right now, the only ones who can pay for it are the chemical companies, and they're not going to do experiments that they don't have to do because, quite frankly, it's not going to be good for their product. So I think it's, unless we all of a sudden get this huge influx of money for the scientific research to be able to identify harms, then it's just not, it's a losing battle, in my opinion.
So how, go ahead.
I'll just add to that EPA relies exclusively on these industry studies when they're evaluating a pesticide, and the whole approval process does not provide for a lot of transparency. So very often we have a very limited picture of what this pesticide is. It's approved, and then we only have 60 days to sue over the pesticide. So it's only available for 60 days before the courtroom door closes to us. And so we haven't seen it used on a broad scale. We're just relying on what we're getting from EPA, and if industry throws us any crumbs as well in revealing information. And so it makes it really hard, because then we have to prove that this pesticide shouldn't have been approved in this very limited informational context.
Was the EPA doing a better job decades ago or before 4 years ago?
I can start this and then you can add Lorianne. The EPA has been doing a very bad job for a very long time. I would say in the 70s, when it was first formed and when pesticide law was first passed, and everyone was sort of riding this wave that happened after Silent Spring was published, the EPA was, they kicked butt. They got rid of a lot of the worst pesticides, and they did it quickly, and they did it very well. But ever since the 70s, we've been on this downward spiral because the pesticide companies have been so good at influencing federal policy and influencing just the inner workings of these agencies. So things were bad 5 years ago, things were bad 10 years ago, and they've been getting progressively worse. I don't know if I've seen it worse than it is right now, but it needs to come back up.
Yeah, I think, in these past few years, we've seen sort of a unprecedented, blatant refusal to properly factor in harms. And we've seen the agency go against previous progress that they've made. It was not peaches and cream before. But it is worse now, for sure, just in the kind of express pro-business, anti-environment climate that we have right now.
Lorianne, I know you have a background in organic farming. There's a question about if industrial agriculture gets more subsidies than organic farms.
Oh, yes. So I think the number is, of all of our agriculture in this country, I think it's 0.1% that's fruit and vegetables. That's the percent of subsidies that goes to fruit and vegetables, and it's also just a very tiny amount of the agriculture that we do in this country. So we're really not focused on producing healthy, nutritious foods that people actually eat. And a massive disparity in ag subsidies. It's one of the most important issues to have on people's minds. Every year this is dealt with in the Farm Bill. These companies have enormous political sway, and it's a really tough battle. But yeah, absolutely, organic farms get nothing compared to big ag.
Nate, this one's probably for you. Someone asked about resistance to pesticides and selection for resistant individuals over time. I guess you could talk about insects and weeds.
Yeah, it certainly happens with both. It happens with all life, fungi, even mammals. Whatever the pest is that's being targeted, if it's exposed to the pesticide for a long period of time, over time, resistance develops. This is just sort of normal natural selection, evolution happening. The strong survive. And so when you're using a pesticide at a level of, say, 300 million pounds a year, like glyphosate's being used at, it's no wonder that there are a ton of weeds that are resistant to glyphosate, which makes glyphosate not quite as useful as it once was, and promotes mixing of herbicides. So now you don't just spray glyphosate on your field, you spray it with another herbicide. And then once resistance develops to that duo, then you spray a third. That's the trajectory we're on right now, is that chemical companies and the regulatory agencies and the extension services acknowledge that resistance is a big issue. But the way that people are proposing to deal with it is just adding more pesticides to the mix. So if your pest, say, I don't know, an aphid or something, becomes resistant to one neonicotinoid, then you add a pyrethroid insecticide on top of that. Then you add a growth regulator on top of that when they become resistant to that. So what we're doing is we're increasing the total pesticide load in the environment well beyond what it used to be. And this is, it's not a sustainable path. It's one we strongly oppose, not only, in our words, but in the courtroom as well. And so, this is the trajectory that our regulatory agencies has been convinced to go down by the pesticide companies. And there are a lot of people who are fighting it, and I'm certain that we'll win eventually. But it's going to take some time.
We're going to wrap up. Do you guys have any closing thoughts? No, didn't mean to
Too
put you on the
much.
spot there. Well, thank you both for joining us today, and thank you at home for being here. Next week, we're going to talk about the insect apocalypse. We're going to talk about saving monarch butterflies and our Saving the Insects campaign. We'll be on Slack tomorrow from noon to 1 Pacific. If we didn't get to your question today, we can get to it then. And you will get an email with an action that you can take to help protect wildlife on national wildlife refuges from pesticides. So thank you so much, and we'll hopefully see you next week.